The massive hands trembled as they reached toward her face, calloused fingers stopping just short of her skin. Alexander Martin's voice cracked like winter ice breaking on the river. "I haven't touched a woman since 1760. The words hung in the air of the small cabin, heavy with decades of isolation and longing. His breath came in ragged gasps as he fought against every instinct that screamed at him to pull away, to retreat into the safety of solitude that had protected him for so long. But Deborah Cooper stood before him, unflinching, her green eyes holding his tortured gaze with a steadiness that shattered something deep within his chest. The mountain man who had survived blizzards and bears, who had carved a life from the unforgiving wilderness with nothing but his bare hands, trembled like a boy at the thought of human touch. The storm had been building for 3 days when Deborah first saw the smoke rising from the chimney of the cabin tucked into the valley below. She pressed her horse harder through the deepening snow, her supplies running dangerously low, and her fingers numb despite the thick gloves. The wind howled through the pines, carrying with it the promise of a blizzard that would trap anyone foolish enough to be caught in the open. Her breath formed clouds in the bitter air as she urged her mare down the treacherous slope, ice crystals stinging her cheeks like tiny needles. She had been traveling for weeks, fleeing the arranged marriage her father had orchestrated with a cruel man whose reputation preceded him like a dark shadow. The bruises on her wrists had finally faded, but the memory of his grip remained, a constant reminder of the life she refused to accept. Better to die free in these mountains than live as a prisoner in silk and lace. The thought had sustained her through the long, cold nights and the endless days of uncertainty. As her horse stumbled through the final drift before the cabin, Deborah caught her first glimpse of the man who would change everything. He stood in the doorway, a figure carved from the very mountains themselves, tall and broad with hair the color of autumn leaves streaked with silver. His face was weathered by decades of sun and wind, marked by lines that spoke of hardship and solitude. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath, pale blue like winter sky, holding a wariness so deep it seemed to pierce straight through to her soul. Alexander Martin had heard the horse approaching long before it appeared through the trees. In 43 years of mountain living, visitors were as rare as summer snow and usually meant trouble. He stepped onto his porch with his rifle in hand, every muscle tense with the readiness that had kept him alive in this harsh land. But when the rider emerged from the storm, his weapon lowered slowly, confusion replacing caution. The woman who sat astride the exhausted mare was unlike anything he had expected. Even bundled in heavy furs and wool, there was something delicate about her features, something that spoke of drawing rooms and tea services rather than wilderness survival. Her dark hair had escaped its pins to frame a face pale with cold and exhaustion, and when their eyes met across the small clearing, he felt something stir in his chest that he had buried so deep he had forgotten it existed. She slumped forward in her saddle. An instinct overrode his natural distrust. He was moving before conscious thought could stop him, crossing the distance between them in long strides. When she began to fall, he caught her, and the contact sent shockwaves through his system. Soft, warm, alive. Everything his world was not. The scent of her hair, still somehow sweet despite days of travel, filled his nostrils and made his head spin with forgotten memories. If you're watching from somewhere warm and safe, drop a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from. Hit that notification bell because you won't want to miss what happens next in this incredible story of survival and unexpected love. Deborah's eyes fluttered open to find herself lying on a rough-hewn bed, heavy quilts piled high around her shivering form. The cabin was small but sturdy, built with the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of a man who understood that his life depended on every joint and beam. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with tools and supplies. The air smelled of pine smoke and something else, something masculine and wild that made her pulse quicken despite her exhaustion. Alexander stood with his back to her, stirring something in a pot that hung over the fire. His movements were precise and economical, the actions of a man accustomed to caring for himself in all things. When he heard her stir, his shoulders tensed, but he did not turn around immediately. Instead, he ladled whatever he was cooking into a wooden bowl and approached the bed with the careful movements of someone approaching a wild animal. "You need to eat," he said, his voice rough from disuse. The words came out harsher than he intended, and he saw her flinch. He had forgotten how to speak to people, how to modulate his tone for anything other than commanding his animals or talking to himself during the long, lonely evenings. The realization brought a flush of shame to his weathered cheeks. Deborah struggled to sit up, accepting the bowl with hands that still trembled from cold and weakness. The stew was simple but nourishing, thick with meat and vegetables that must have come from his own garden and hunting. As warmth spread through her body, she found the courage to study her rescuer more closely. There was something about the way he held himself, a careful distance that spoke of more than just mountain isolation. It was the posture of a man who had been hurt, who had learned to protect himself by keeping the world at arm's length. "What's your name?" she asked softly, and saw him freeze as if the simple question was somehow dangerous. "Alexander Martin," he replied after a long pause. He had not spoken his full name aloud in years. Most of the time, there was no one to speak to at all. The sound of it in his own voice felt strange, like wearing clothes that no longer fit properly. "I'm Deborah Cooper," she said, offering a small smile that transformed her tired features. "Thank you for saving me. I don't think I would have lasted much longer out there." He nodded curtly and turned away, but not before she caught a glimpse of something vulnerable in those pale eyes. "The storm's getting worse," he said, moving to peer out the single window. "You'll have to stay until it passes." Could be days. The prospect should have frightened her. Alone in a cabin with a strange man miles from civilization. Instead, she felt only relief. For the first time in months, she was warm and safe, with food in her belly and shelter from the storm. Whatever dangers Alexander Martin might pose, they seemed insignificant compared to what she had left behind. As night fell, the wind outside rose to a howling crescendo that shook the cabin's sturdy walls. Alexander had given her his bed and made himself a pallet by the fire, but sleep eluded them both. The space between them seemed charged with an awareness that neither was willing to acknowledge. She watched the play of firelight across his profile as he stared into the flames, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way his hands clenched and unclenched, as if fighting some internal battle. "Why are you out here alone?" she asked finally, her voice barely audible above the storm. His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would not answer. Then in a voice so low she had to strain to hear it, he said, "Sometimes alone is safer." The words carried a weight that made her chest ache. She understood that kind of safety, the protection that came from keeping the world at a distance. But she also understood its cost, the slow erosion of the soul that came from denying the most basic human need for connection. "Safer from what?" she pressed gently. Alexander's hands clenched into fists, and when he turned to look at her, his eyes held a pain so raw it took her breath away. "From everything," he said, and she heard in those two words the echo of her own fears, her own desperate flight from a world that had tried to break her. The storm raged for 3 days, trapping them together in the small cabin like castaways on an island of warmth and light, in an ocean of howling wind and driving snow. At first, they moved around each other with careful politeness, two wounded souls maintaining the distance that had become their armor. But gradually, inevitably, the barriers began to crack. It started with small things. Alexander teaching her to bank the fire properly, his large hands guiding hers as he showed her how to arrange the logs for maximum heat and minimum smoke. The brief contact sent electricity shooting up her arms, and she saw his sharp intake of breath, the way he pulled away as if burned. But the next time she struggled with the heavy iron pot, he was there again, his presence solid and reassuring behind her. Deborah found ways to be useful despite her unfamiliarity with wilderness life. She mended a tear in his heavy coat with neat, precise stitches that spoke of a genteel upbringing, and organized his meager supplies with an efficiency that impressed him. When she discovered his small collection of books, worn from countless readings, her face lit up with a joy that transformed her entirely. "You read," she said, running her fingers over the cracked leather bindings with reverence. "I thought I might never see another book again." Alexander watched her handle his treasured volumes with the same care she might show to precious jewels, and something tight in his chest began to loosen. "Not many folks up here care much for reading," he said gruffly. "What's your favorite?" she asked, settling cross-legged on the floor beside his chair, like a child eager for a story. He hesitated, then reached for a slim volume of poetry that had been his mother's. The pages fell open to a well-worn passage, and without thinking, he began to read aloud. His voice, rough from disuse, gradually smoothed as he lost himself in the familiar words. When he looked up, he found Deborah watching him with an expression of such tender understanding that his throat closed with emotion. "That was beautiful," she whispered. "Will you read more?" And so the evenings passed, with Alexander's deep voice filling the cabin as he read to her by firelight. Sometimes she would read to him, her clear, educated tones bringing new life to passages he had memorized years ago. They discovered a shared love of Shakespeare, of Wordsworth, of the old ballads that spoke of love and loss and redemption. In those moments, the years of isolation seemed to fall away from Alexander's shoulders, and Deborah glimpsed the man he had been before, whatever tragedy had driven him to these mountains. On the second night, she asked him about his past, and this time he did not deflect the question entirely. "I had a farm once," he said, staring into the fire, "down in Pennsylvania. Good land, good house. I was going to be married." "What happened?" she asked softly. His face went hard, the familiar shutters slamming down over his eyes. "She died," he said simply. "Fever took her and half the county. I couldn't stay after that. Too many ghosts." Deborah felt tears prick her eyes at the pain in his voice. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Alexander shrugged, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Was a long time ago. 43 years I've been up here. Haven't seen much point in coming down." The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. 43 years of solitude, of denying himself the most basic human connections. It explained so much about the way he moved through the world, careful and guarded, like a man walking on ice that might crack at any moment. "What about you?" he asked, clearly eager to turn the conversation away from his own pain. "What are you running from?" Deborah's hands twisted in her lap as she considered how much to reveal. "My father arranged a marriage," she said finally, "to a man who thought he owned me before the vows were even spoken." She touched her wrist unconsciously, where the faint marks of old bruises had finally faded. "I couldn't go through with it." Alexander's eyes followed the gesture, and his face went dark with anger. "He hurt you," he said, and it was not a question. She nodded, surprised by the protective fury she saw in his expression. "He said it was his right, that I needed to learn obedience, that it would be worse after we were married if I didn't submit willingly now." The growl that rumbled from Alexander's chest was purely animalistic, and for a moment Deborah saw the dangerous man who had survived decades in the wilderness, who had faced down bears and wolves and lived to tell the tale. "Any man who would raise his hand to a woman deserves to have it cut off," he said with quiet vehemence. The intensity of his reaction stirred something deep in Deborah's chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling nearby. When was the last time anyone had been angry on her behalf, had seen her pain as worthy of such fierce protection? Her father had dismissed her fears, her mother had counseled submission, and her friends had envied her advantageous match. Only this mountain hermit, this man who claimed to want nothing to do with the world, had looked at her bruises and seen them for what they were. "You're safe here," Alexander said, his voice gentling as he saw the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "No one will hurt you while you're under my roof." The simple promise, spoken with such quiet conviction, broke something loose inside her. The tears came then, weeks of suppressed fear and grief pouring out in great, shuddering sobs. She expected him to retreat, to give her the space that men usually demanded when faced with feminine emotion. Instead, after a moment's hesitation, she felt his large hand settle gently on her shoulder, offering comfort in the only way he knew how. His touch was careful, reverent, as if she were made of spun glass that might shatter at the slightest pressure. Through her tears, she realized that his hand was shaking, that this simple gesture of comfort was costing him something. When had he last touched another human being? When had anyone touched him? Gradually, her sobs subsided, but she found herself reluctant to pull away from the warmth of his hand. He seemed equally reluctant to remove it, his thumb moving in small, soothing circles against her shoulder blade. The silence that stretched between them was different now, charged with an awareness that neither could ignore. "Alexander," she whispered, and heard a sharp intake of breath at the sound of his name on her lips. His hand stilled, and she could feel the war raging within him, the battle between decades of self-imposed isolation and the fundamental human need for connection. Slowly, she turned to face him, her movement causing his hand to slide from her shoulder to cup her cheek. The contact sent shockwaves through both of them, and she saw his eyes widen with something that might have been fear. "I should not," he said hoarsely, but his thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone with infinite tenderness. "Why?" she asked, covering his hand with both of hers to keep it in place. "Because I am not fit for the company of decent women," he said, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "Because I have lived like an animal for so long, I have forgotten how to be a man. Because you deserve better than a broken hermit who has nothing to offer but a cabin in the wilderness and a heart that stopped working 43 years ago." The raw honesty of his confession made her breath catch. She could see the truth of it in his eyes, the genuine belief that he was somehow less than human, unworthy of the connection he craved. It broke her heart and ignited her anger in equal measure. "You think I'm some delicate flower who needs silk gowns and fancy drawing rooms to be happy?" she asked, her voice gaining strength. "You think I care about your rough hands or your simple cabin?" She stood, pulling him up with her, their faces now inches apart. "I have been surrounded by civilized men my entire life, Alexander Martin, and not one of them showed me a fraction of the kindness you have in the past 3 days." His breathing was ragged, his eyes searching her face as if trying to determine whether her words were real or some cruel hallucination brought on by too many years alone. "I don't know how to be with people anymore," he said desperately. "I don't know how to be gentle." "Then learn," she whispered, rising on her toes to close the distance between them. The kiss was tentative at first, a barely there brush of lips that sent lightning through both their systems. Alexander froze, his entire body rigid with shock and longing, and for a moment Deborah feared she had pushed too hard, too fast. Then his arms came around her with crushing intensity, and he was kissing her back with 43 years of suppressed need and desperate hunger. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their foreheads pressed together as they struggled to process what had just happened. Alexander's hands shook as they framed her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw with wonder. "Deborah," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly, reading the fear in his eyes. "The storm will pass, but I'm not leaving you alone again." The promise seemed to unlock something in him, and he kissed her again, this time with less desperation and more reverence. His lips moved against hers with growing confidence, relearning the rhythm of intimacy that he had forced himself to forget. When his tongue traced the seam of her lips, she opened for him with a soft moan that made his knees weak. They moved together toward the bed, a dance of tentative touches and whispered endearments. Alexander's hands mapped the curve of her waist through her dress, marveling at the softness of her, the way she fit against him as if she had been made for his arms. Every touch was a revelation, a reminder of what it meant to be alive, to be human, to be connected to another soul. "Are you certain?" he asked when they reached the edge of the bed, his voice rough with desire and uncertainty. "Once we cross this line, I will not be able to let you go." The raw honesty of the admission made her heart race. She could see the truth of it in his eyes, then the knowledge that he was offering her not just his body, but his very soul, damaged and scarred though it might be. The weight of that offering, the trust it represented, humbled her. "I don't want you to let me go," she said, beginning to work at the buttons of her dress with fingers that trembled only slightly. "I want to stay here with you, in this cabin, in these mountains. I want to build a life with you." Alexander's hands covered hers, stilling her movements. "You don't know what you're saying," he said desperately. "You're a lady, raised for better things than this wilderness can offer. When spring comes, you'll remember the world you left behind and regret this choice." Deborah pulled her hands free and continued undressing, her movements gaining confidence as she saw the hunger flare in his eyes. "I know exactly what I'm saying," she said firmly. "I've lived in that world, Alexander, and it nearly destroyed me. Here with you, I feel alive for the first time in my life." Her dress pooled at her feet, leaving her in only her chemise and stockings. Alexander's breath caught at the sight of her, pale and perfect in the firelight, more beautiful than any dream he had allowed himself during the long, lonely years. When she reached for the ties of her chemise, his control finally snapped. He swept her up in his arms, marveling at her slight weight, and laid her gently on the bed. His own clothes seemed to disappear, as if by magic, years of wilderness living having taught him efficiency in all things. When he settled beside her, skin against skin for the first time in over 4 decades, he thought he might die from the sheer intensity of sensation. "Deborah," he breathed, running his hands over her body with reverent wonder. So beautiful, so perfect. She arched beneath his touch, her own hands exploring the hard plains of his chest, the scars that told the story of his survival in this harsh land. Each mark was a testament to his strength, his refusal to give up even when he had lost everything that mattered. She pressed her lips to a particularly vicious scar near his shoulder and felt him shudder beneath her touch. "What happened here?" she whispered against his skin. "Bear," he said roughly. "3 winters ago. Thought I was going to die alone in the snow." "But you didn't," she said, looking up at him with eyes that blazed with fierce pride. "You survived. You're here with me now." The simple affirmation seemed to break the last of his restraints, and he rolled over her, settling between her thighs with a groan of pure need. For a moment they simply looked at each other, drinking in the reality of their connection, the miracle of finding love in the most unlikely of places. Alexander entered her slowly, carefully, his face a mask of concentration as he fought to maintain control. The sensation of being joined with her after so many years of solitude was overwhelming, and he had to pause, breathing heavily, to keep from losing himself entirely. Deborah's soft gasp of pleasure beneath him was like music, a sound he had never thought to hear again. "Move," she whispered, her hands gripping his shoulders as she adjusted to the feel of him inside her. "Please, Alexander." He began to move then, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, as she met him thrust for thrust. The years of loneliness fell away like shed skin, leaving only this moment, this connection, this perfect joining of 2 souls who had found each other against all odds. When her climax took her, crying out his name like a benediction, he followed her over the edge with a shout that echoed through the small cabin. Afterward, they lay entwined, their breathing gradually returning to normal as the fire settled to glowing embers. Alexander held her against his chest, still hardly able to believe that this was real, that she was here in his arms and not some fever dream brought on by too many years of isolation. "I love you," Deborah whispered against his throat, and he felt the words like a physical blow. He had not heard those words in 43 years, had not expected to hear them ever again. The magnitude of what she was offering him, the trust and faith it represented, left him speechless. When he finally found his voice, it was thick with emotion. "I love you too," he said, the words rusty from disuse, but no less true for their awkwardness. "I didn't think I remembered how." She raised her head to look at him, her eyes soft with understanding. "Love isn't something you forget," she said gently. "It just goes to sleep sometimes, waiting for the right person to wake it up." The storm broke the next morning, leaving the world outside transformed by fresh snow that sparkled like diamonds in the weak winter sun. Alexander woke to find Deborah already up, standing at the window in his oversized shirt, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. "Beautiful," he said, coming up behind her to wrap his arms around her waist. "Yes," she agreed, leaning back against his chest. "I can see why you stayed." They spent the morning in lazy contentment, sharing breakfast and making plans for the future. Alexander showed her around his small domain, pointing out the root cellar where he stored vegetables, the smokehouse where he preserved meat, the small barn where he kept his animals. Everything was neat and well maintained, the work of a man who understood that survival depended on attention to detail. "I'll need to expand the cabin," he said, studying the structure with a critical eye. Add another room, maybe a proper kitchen, and we'll need a bigger garden come spring. The casual assumption that she would stay, that they would build a life together, made her heart soar. She had been prepared to convince him, to argue her case, but he seemed to have accepted her decision with the same quiet certainty that marked all his actions. What about supplies? She asked practically. I have some money, enough to last us through the winter if we're careful. Alexander's face darkened at the mention of money, and she realized she had touched on his pride, the masculine need to provide for his woman. Don't need your money, he said gruffly. I've been taking care of myself up here for 4 decades. I can take care of you too. She bit back her first response, recognizing the importance of this to him. Instead, she moved closer, placing her hand on his arm. I know you can, she said softly, but we're partners now, aren't we? That means we share everything, good and bad. The word partners seemed to resonate with him in a way that husband and wife might not have. It spoke of equality, of mutual respect, and shared responsibility rather than ownership and dominance. Slowly, his shoulders relaxed and he nodded. Partners, he repeated, as if testing the word. I like the sound of that. They spent the afternoon making love again, this time without the desperate urgency of the night before. Alexander took his time exploring her body, relearning the art of giving pleasure, marveling at every soft sigh and whispered endearment. When she returned the favor, mapping the hard planes of his body with hands and lips, he thought he might die from the sheer intensity of sensation. As evening approached, they sat before the fire, Deborah curled against Alexander's side as he read to her from one of his treasured books. The domestic contentment of the scene would have seemed impossible just days before, but now it felt as natural as breathing. This was what he had been missing all these years. Not just physical intimacy, but this simple companionship, the pleasure of sharing his thoughts and dreams with another person. Tell me about your family, Deborah said during a lull in the reading. Do you have anyone who might worry about you? Alexander's jaw tightened slightly, and she felt him withdraw, even as his arms remained around her. All dead, he said shortly. Parents, siblings, everyone I cared about. That's why I came up here in the first place. The pain in his voice made her chest ache. She had lost her freedom, her security, her place in society, but she still had family who loved her, even if they had been misguided in their attempts to protect her. Alexander had lost everything, everyone, and had been carrying that grief alone for over 4 decades. I'm sorry, she whispered, pressing a kiss to his throat. That must have been unbearable. For a long time it was, he admitted. Some days I thought about just walking out into a blizzard and not coming back. Would have been easier than facing another empty year. What stopped you? She asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. Stubbornness, mostly, he said with a bitter laugh. My pa always said I was too ornery to die easy, and maybe some part of me hoped that someday things might get better. They did, she said firmly. We found each other. Alexander turned to look at her, his pale eyes searching her face as if trying to memorize every detail. You really mean to stay, he said, and it was not quite a question. For as long as you'll have me, she replied without hesitation. That might be forever, he warned, but there was hope in his voice now, fragile but growing stronger. I'm counting on it, she said, and sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted of forever. The next few days passed in a blur of domestic bliss and passionate nights. Alexander taught her the skills she would need to survive in the mountains, how to read the weather signs, how to preserve food, how to handle the animals. She proved an eager student, her quick mind grasping concepts that some mountain folk took years to learn. In return, she brought refinement to his rough existence, cooking meals that were more than mere sustenance, organizing his supplies with an efficiency that impressed him, and filling the long winter evenings with conversation and laughter. But it was in the quiet moments, the stolen glances and gentle touches, that their love truly flourished. Alexander found himself reaching for her hand as they walked, pulling her close as they stood watching the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant colors. The casual intimacy of it still amazed him, the simple pleasure of having someone to share his thoughts with, someone who cared about his opinions and dreams. One morning, about a week after the storm had passed, Alexander woke to find the bed beside him empty. Panic seized him for a moment. The old fear that this had all been a dream, that he would find himself alone again in his cold cabin. But then he heard her voice outside, talking to the animals as she fed them, and relief flooded through him. He dressed quickly and stepped onto the porch to find her standing in the small corral, his old mare nuzzling her hand as she scratched behind the horse's ears. She had braided her dark hair back in a practical style and wore one of his old shirts over her dress, looking for all the world like she belonged here in this wild place. "Morning," she called when she saw him, her face lighting up with a smile that still had the power to stop his heart. "Your mare is expecting. Did you know?" Alexander blinked in surprise. "Expecting?" "But she's past 20 years old," he protested, moving to join Deborah at the fence. "Age doesn't always matter," Deborah said with a knowing smile, running her hand along the mare's swollen sides. "I'd say she's got another month or two to go." The implications hit him like a physical blow. A foal meant the future, meant planning beyond mere survival, meant hope for something better. He had not allowed himself to think in such terms for so long that the concept felt foreign, almost frightening. "That's good," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Real good." Deborah studied his face, reading the complex mix of emotions there with the intuitive understanding that had developed between them. "Change is scary," she said gently, "but it can also be wonderful." He nodded, not trusting his voice. Everything about his carefully ordered existence was changing, had been changing since the moment she rode into his life. The solitude that had once been his protection now felt like a prison he was eager to escape. That afternoon they made love with a tenderness that left them both breathless and clinging to each other, as if they were the only solid things in a shifting world. Alexander whispered endearments against her skin, words he had thought he would never say again, promises that scared him with their intensity. "I want to give you everything," he said, his voice breaking with the force of his emotion. "I want to be the man you deserve." "You already are," she replied, framing his face with her hands. "You saved me, Alexander, not just from the storm, but from a life that would have killed my spirit. You gave me freedom, gave me love, gave me a future worth living." The simple words shattered the last of his defenses, and he buried his face in her neck, his shoulders shaking with the force of emotions too long suppressed. She held him as he wept, her hands stroking his hair, her voice murmuring soft words of comfort and love. When the storm passed, both the one outside and the one in his heart, they lay entwined in the growing darkness, listening to the wind whisper through the pines. The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer empty, filled with possibilities that neither had dared to imagine just days before. "Spring will come eventually," Alexander said, his voice thoughtful. "We'll need to make plans." "What kind of plans?" Deborah asked, though she thought she knew. "There's a preacher down in the valley, about a day's ride south," he said carefully. "Might be we should pay him a visit when the snow clears." The proposal, if it could be called that, was so perfectly Alexander that she had to smile. Practical, understated, but carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "Might be we should," she agreed, and felt his arms tighten around her. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Alexander's life. Each morning brought new discoveries, small intimacies that he treasured like precious gems. The way Deborah hummed while she worked, the way she curled against him in sleep, the way she looked at him as if he were something precious rather than a rough mountain man with more scars than social graces. She proved remarkably adaptable to wilderness life, her natural intelligence and determination overcoming her sheltered upbringing. Within a month, she could split kindling, tend the animals, and read the weather signs almost as well as he could. But more than that, she brought joy back into his existence, filling his days with laughter and his nights with passion. The old mare did indeed foal in early spring, producing a leggy colt with his mother's gentle temperament and his unknown father's spirited nature. Alexander and Deborah stood together in the corral, watching the newborn take his first unsteady steps, and both understood the symbolism of new life beginning just as their own lives were starting over. "We should name him," Deborah said, her hand finding Alexander's. "Hope," Alexander said without hesitation, and she squeezed his fingers in understanding. As the snow began to melt and the first green shoots appeared in the garden, they made plans for their trip to the valley. Alexander had not been among people in over a year, and the prospect filled him with anxiety. But Deborah's steady presence beside him gave him courage, and he found himself looking forward to making their union official in the eyes of God and man. The journey down the mountain was like traveling through a painting, with wildflowers beginning to bloom and streams running full with snowmelt. Deborah rode beside him on her own mare, now well-rested and healthy, and Alexander marveled at how right it felt to have a companion on the trail, someone to share the beauty of the wilderness with. They reached the small settlement as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The few residents they encountered stared openly at the mountain hermit and his beautiful companion, but Alexander found he cared less about their opinions than he had expected. Let them stare. He had found something worth more than their approval. The preacher, a kind-faced man named Gary Brooks, welcomed them warmly and agreed to perform the ceremony the next morning. That night, they stayed in the settlement's small inn, and Alexander lay awake listening to Deborah's breathing, still hardly able to believe that tomorrow she would be his wife in truth as well as in heart. The ceremony was simple, attended only by the preacher and his wife, but to Alexander it felt like the most important moment of his life. When Gary Brooks pronounced them husband and wife, and Deborah turned to him with tears of joy in her eyes, he felt as if he were being reborn, as if the lonely hermit he had been was dying to make room for the man he was becoming. Their wedding night was spent in the inn's small room, making love with a passion intensified by the knowledge that they now belonged to each other completely and forever. Alexander whispered his vows against her skin, promises that went far beyond the simple words they had spoken in front of the preacher. "I will love you until the mountains crumble and the rivers run dry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I will protect you with my life and cherish you with my soul. And I will stand beside you through whatever comes," she replied, her own voice breaking with the force of her feelings. "In sickness and health, in plenty and want, in joy and sorrow. Forever, Alexander, forever and always." They returned to the mountain as husband and wife, their hearts light with joy and their future bright with promise. The cabin that had once been Alexander's refuge from the world was now their home, filled with love and laughter and the thousand small intimacies of married life. Summer brought its own challenges and rewards. They expanded the garden, adding vegetables that Deborah remembered from her childhood, and worked together to improve the cabin, adding the extra room Alexander had promised, and upgrading the kitchen with conveniences that made their daily life easier. Every improvement was a labor of love, an investment in their shared future. The mare's colt grew strong and healthy, living up to his name as he brought hope and joy to their daily routine. Alexander taught Deborah to ride him, laughing at her determination to master the spirited young horse despite several spectacular falls. Her courage and resilience never ceased to amaze him, the way she threw herself wholeheartedly into their mountain life without a single complaint about the hardships or isolation. As autumn approached, bringing with it the brilliant colors that painted the mountainside like a vast tapestry, Deborah began to show signs of her own new life growing within her. The discovery filled them both with wonder and a joy so intense it was almost frightening. Alexander, who had given up all hope of family decades ago, found himself planning for a future that included children's laughter echoing through their valley. The prospect of becoming a father at his age should have terrified him, but instead it filled him with a fierce protectiveness and determination to be the best man he could be. He had lost one family to tragedy, but he would not lose this one. He would protect Deborah and their child with his life, would give them everything he had to offer and more. Winter came early that year, but they were ready for it. Their root cellar was full, their woodshed stocked, their animals healthy and strong. As the first snows began to fall, they sat before their fire, Deborah's hand resting on her growing belly, while Alexander read aloud from their collection of books. "Are you happy?" he asked during a lull in the reading, the question that had been haunting him for weeks finally finding voice. Deborah looked up from her mending, her face glowing with contentment. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she said without hesitation. "This life, this place, you, everything we've built together, it's more than I ever dared to hope for." Even though it's not the life you were raised for? He pressed, needing to hear her reassurance. Especially because it's not the life I was raised for, she replied firmly. That life would have killed my spirit, Alexander. This life has set my soul free. Her words settled something deep in his chest, the last lingering doubt that had plagued him since their marriage. She was here by choice, not desperation, and she was as committed to their future as he was. As winter deepened and Deborah's pregnancy progressed, their love only grew stronger. Alexander marveled at the changes in her body, the way she bloomed with new life, and treated her with a reverence that made her feel like the most precious thing in the world. He anticipated her every need, cushioned her against every hardship, and loved her with a devotion that took her breath away. Their child was born on a clear, cold morning in February with only Alexander there to help bring new life into the world. The sight of his son, red-faced and squalling with indignation at his sudden entrance into the cold world, reduced the mountain man to tears of joy and wonder. As Alexander held his newborn son for the first time, his massive hands trembling with emotion and awe, he thought back to that moment months ago when he had confessed his decades of isolation to Deborah. "I haven't touched a woman since 1760, he had said, the words torn from the depths of his lonely soul. Now looking down at the perfect little face of his child, feeling Deborah's hand slip into his free one, he marveled at the miracle of redemption that had transformed his life. The baby's cry filled the cabin, strong and healthy, and Alexander felt his heart expand with a love so fierce it threatened to overwhelm him. This tiny person, this perfect blend of himself and the woman who had saved him from a lifetime of solitude, represented everything he had thought lost forever: hope, future, family, love. "Welcome to the world, little one," he whispered, his voice thick with tears. "Your mom and I have been waiting for you." Deborah watched her husband cradle their son with infinite tenderness, and her heart overflowed with gratitude for the path that had led her to this moment. The arranged marriage she had fled, the storm that had driven her to his cabin, the lonely years that had prepared them both for this love, all of it had been necessary to bring them to this perfect moment of completion. "What shall we name him?" she asked softly, her own eyes bright with tears of joy. Alexander looked from his son to his wife, these two people who had given his life meaning beyond mere survival. "Thomas," he said finally, "after my father, Thomas Hope Martin." The name was perfect, honoring the past while embracing the future, and Deborah nodded her approval. "Thomas Hope Martin," she repeated, testing the sound of it. "Our son." As the days passed and they settled into the rhythm of life with a newborn, Alexander found himself constantly amazed by the depth of his capacity for love. He had thought his heart was dead, killed by decades of grief and isolation, but Deborah and Thomas had brought it back to life with a vengeance. Every smile, every gurgle, every tiny fist that wrapped around his finger was a miracle that left him breathless with wonder. The mountain man who had once believed himself unfit for human company now spent hours talking to his son, telling him stories of the wilderness, singing half-remembered lullabies from his own childhood, making promises about the future they would build together. Deborah would watch these tender moments with tears in her eyes, marveling at the transformation love had worked in her fierce, gentle husband. Spring came early that year, as if the world itself was celebrating the new life that had entered it. As the snow melted and the first wildflowers began to bloom, Alexander stood on his porch with his son in his arms and his wife beside him, looking out over the valley that had been his refuge and was now his kingdom. "This is all yours someday," he told Thomas, who responded by trying to grab his father's beard with chubby fingers. "All of it, and more besides. You'll never want for love or security or purpose, I promise you that." The vow was spoken with the same quiet intensity that marked all of Alexander's important words, and Deborah knew he would spend the rest of his life making sure it was kept. Their son would grow up surrounded by love, taught to value both the wild beauty of their mountain home and the precious gift of human connection. As evening approached and they prepared to go inside, Alexander paused to look back at the path that wound down the mountain toward the world below. Once that path had represented everything he wanted to escape from, all the pain and loss that had driven him into exile. Now it was simply one route among many, a connection to the larger world that he no longer feared or needed to avoid. He had found his place, his purpose, his family. The lonely hermit was gone, replaced by a husband and father whose heart was full to overflowing with love and gratitude. The mountains that had once been his prison were now his paradise, made perfect by the presence of the two people who had taught him that it was never too late for a new beginning, never too late to learn that love could indeed conquer all. The trembling hands that had once been afraid to touch another human being now cradled his son with perfect confidence, and the heart that had been frozen for 43 years now beat with the warmth of a love that would last forever. Alexander Martin had been claimed, body and soul, by the woman who had ridden into his life on a winter storm and the child who had completed their perfect circle of love,